I thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would like to call this meeting to order and acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Ojibwe, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. My name is Carrie Linklater, and I am your chairperson this morning. And on the panel, I am joined by Ms. Diane Knight and Mr. Kevin Stephenson, both via Zoom. Our secretary is Mrs. Crystal Harland, and our assessor is Mr. Justin Mikulik. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. Statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by City Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed, with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today, and the session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. And as information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. This morning, we'll be hearing items 3, 4, 6, and 8 on our docket. And Mrs. Harland, would you please affirm the assessor and the applicant's testimony?
Yes, Madam Chair. Mr. Assessor, would you please state your full name? Oh, I think you're mute.
Justin Mikulik.
Thank you. Do you affirm that the evidence you are about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Would you please rise, Ms. Applicant? Thank you. Would you please state your full name?
Farah Cates.
Thank you. Do you affirm that the evidence you are about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please be seated.
Good morning, Ms. Pates, and good morning, Mr. Mikulik. We are going to begin with our first property, item number 3 on the docket, which is 2350, which is at 2350 McGillivray Boulevard, and we are looking at assessed value this morning.
Yep. And
whenever you're ready, Mr. Mikulik.
Okay. So we have file number 24-1346, roll number 030-929-78535, 2350 McGillivray Boulevard, roll year 2025, assessed value 23,738,000. Classification 20, liability T. I do have a recommendation. I forgot to put it in my brief here, but it would be to reduce the value to 23,034,000.
And Mr. Mikulik, what is the basis for that reduction?
Yeah, so on page 4 of my brief, I had done a rough calculation here of an adjusted net operating income. So it'd be lowering the net operating income and using the 4.7% cap rate.
All right. Ms. Cates, are you willing to accept this recommendation?
I think we're still a bit too far apart, so I'd like to proceed.
All right, I thank you. Mr. Mikulik?
Okay, so on that front, we'll continue on. And so we have a property here that has two buildings. There's a like a 4-story apartment, and then there's some, I guess they're kind of like townhouses on the other plot on the property. So they're built in 2014, 92 suites. If you go to page 2, you could see the location here, which is right across from the Costco on McGilvery. So a pretty good location wise, close to a lot of amenities, good neighborhoods. You usually get good quality clientele renting here as well. Yeah, going forward to so we've touched on the income on that. I've adjusted it. And it was based on their actuals, that their income and expenses. So we can disregard the model calculation at this point. I'll forward to cap rates on page 5. So regarding the city of Winnipeg cap rates for multifamily, you could see where we fall in between the 20th to 80th percentile, 4.75 to 5.45. And then how that would compare to other broker reports. So you could see where Colliers, they have a standard 5 to 6 CBRE. It kind of ranges between their high rise and low rises, A and B. And then Cushman and Wakefield between their high rise and low rises. So the city of Winnipeg, really, we're not out of line in our model generated cap rates that are being applied in this instance. And on page 6, we've provided some sales here to support the model cap rate. So these were sales that took place up to the reference period. Yeah, you could see where cap rates range and how they were stabilized using 3-year net operating income. We stabilized that information to get these cap rates into the sale price. And then so this would be the result. We're at 4.71, or sorry, 4.70. 2390 McPhillips, built in 2015. We stabilized that at 4.71. I'm sure folks have heard about it at this point, but we feel that based on that the cap rate here, 4.7, being in the location that it is, we don't see that being unreasonable to come up with that type of cap rate. And if you go to page 8, I've just shown a building description here of the type of property we're dealing with. So these are just pictures from their website. You could see that the suites are fairly good quality. Buildings are well maintained. You tend to get really good clientele renting these type of properties. So I would say that this would probably classify as a pretty good investment style property with the net income that it does generate. It is fairly stable that way as well. So you could just see the differences on page 9, where you kind of have the townhouse buildings on the right with the garages, and then you have on the left the apartment style. So there is that mix on the property. And page 10, sorry, page 10, you could see the rents, the gross rents, 1,832,616. Again, I made my adjustment and recommendation based on these reported income statements, but you can see, like, just when you do look through them, I provided a couple years worth, that the income generated is fairly consistent, fairly stable. Again, good clients. You don't really get high vacancy in a place like this. So all in all, we feel that where the cap rate comes in at 4.7 is appropriate. And like I said, we revised the net operating income down a touch. So other than that, that would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mikulik, before we begin questioning, could you just give us your new NOI, please?
Yeah, the NOI would be 1,082,585.
All right, I thank you. And Ms. Cates, did you have any questions?
Yes, thank you. So for your income value summary on page 3, in regard to the cap rate, that would be a bit below your 20th percentile, is that correct?
Yeah, it is a tip below there.
And then for your cap rate table on page 5, in looking at the range 475 to 545, can you provide any other information on how many sales are being used in there or what type of properties?
Yeah, so it does say, there is a paragraph here that does say above the assessed values produced by the application of the model generated, capitalization rates were compared to sale prices and assessment to sale ratios. So the resulting statistics, of our income producing model does fall in line with standards set out in IAAO. I don't have the exact number of sales that would have went into that generation.
Okay. And then regarding your cap rate evidence on page 6, do you have any of the workups provided or just the final figures?
At this point, it's just the final figures. We don't have the workups in terms of for privacy concerns of some of these properties that we can't submit that, so. Unfortunately, I don't have that information.
Okay, thank you. And I would also have some rebuttal when that time comes. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And Ms. Knight, any questions?
No, ma'am.
And Mr. Stephenson?
No questions, thank you.
Okay. So I just have couple of questions. So you've changed your NOI, Mr. Mikulik?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, you may have stated it, but I didn't quite catch it. What was the basis of the change?
Just based on the reported actual income, so the pages 11, 12, just looking at the recalibrated income and expenses compared to where our model was coming in at. I felt like we were a little bit too high, so I came down based on that.
Okay. So as it was pointed out, your cap rate is below your 20th percentile, correct?
Yeah, and I mean, that's still common that you're gonna see those things where there are cap rates that are lower than the 20th percentile, and there are ones that still come out higher, right? I mean, the 20th to 80th is just the kind of the meat of a bell curve, really.
Okay, so given that this is a 10-year-old building already, there wouldn't be any consideration. This was model driven, I'm assuming this 4.7, correct?
Yeah, it's model driven, and I mean 2390 McPhillips, which sold in 2020, we stabilized at 4.71. So we really don't feel that there's a need to adjust the cap rate on this. I think the model's pretty accurate.
All right, I thank you. And Ms. Cates, if you'd like to proceed with your brief.
Thank you. So if you turn to page 2, we have a summary of some of the facts of the property along with our requested assessment of $20,793,000. On page 4, under scope of work, I did visit this property in August and have included some photos of the interior and exterior in the appendix. If you go to page 6, we have our property maps. So an aerial map view of the parcel along with a Google map view to get a sense of the neighborhood. And then some exterior photos on page 7 and 8. So you could see the apartment and then the townhouse units. On page 9, there's a property description. So the subject property is on the south side of McGilvery, west of Columbia Drive in the White Ridge area. There are 2 buildings, which include a 4-story apartment and 2-story townhouse, built in 2014. There are 92 units, including 16 1-bedroom, 62 bedroom, and 16 3-bedroom. And there are 73 indoor parking stalls and 67 surface stalls. And I note that the subject property is also adjacent to a rail line. If you turn to page 14, we have the overview of our income approach. So we are applying potential market gross rents of $1,717,720 or $15.56 per unit per month, based on the actual stabilized income reported for the property. We are applying a market vacancy of 3.1% and an expense allowance of $730,828 or 41.3% of effective gross income, based on a 3-year stabilization of operating expenses along with a 5-year stabilization of the repair and maintenance expense. If you turn to page 15, we have our cap rate for the subject property. We are applying a cap rate of 5% based on our cap rate study. So this would fall into the category of newer apartments, 2005 plus. That would start at 5%. We know that the property is wood frame. It has amenities that we would expect, gym, in-suite laundry. It's in good condition, has sufficient parking, so we're not considering any adjustments. We're just sticking with our base cap rate. If you turn to page 17, we have our income and expense breakdown. So in terms of stabilization, the income would typically be stabilized based on the most recent year of operation. And for the expenses, typically expenses would go up over time. So for the most part, the expenses are contemplating the 2022 expense. But for some expenses such as office supplies, professional fees, they are known to fluctuate a bit more. So in order to mitigate that fluctuation, we take an average. So in terms of what's been done to each, in the remarks column, we make note of that. So that's on the right-hand side of the sheet. So we have our potential market gross rents, as mentioned, of $15.56 per unit per month, or $1,717,720. We apply a market vacancy of 3.1%. The property does a good job mitigating its vacancy, but the idea with the analysis is to kind of look at the long-term perspective of the property. And when we look at a property with 92 units, putting in a market vacancy of 3.1%, it assumes that, at certain points, there may be 2 to 3 units vacant in the property. So that would be standard treatment of the vacancy. And then in terms of the miscellaneous income, we also take an average just because it does seem to fluctuate. So we have an effective gross income of $1,770,457. We have total expenses of $730,828. That includes stabilized repair and maintenance at $1,758 per unit. So we get an NOI of $1,039,629, and with a 5% cap rate, gives an indicated value of $20,793,000. On page 18, we have our repair and maintenance breakdown. So what we do is we take a look at these figures line by line, and we will remove outliers, so amounts that seem too high or too low and may not be representative. So those are noted in red. And that's how we get our stabilized figure of $1,758. I would note that while this is a newer property, it has been operating for several years. So these figures are going to be fairly true to the property and would be more accurate than kind of a modeled approach. And then at this point, if I may just briefly go through our cap rate study, it's a separate document that I submitted. So if you could let me know when you have that available, and I could just briefly go through that.
Got it.
Yep, if you'd like to proceed.
Thank you. So in our cap rate study, if you turn to page 2, there's some discussion about how to calculate the cap rate and what considerations might be taken. The idea for cap rates is that you stabilize the financials into a single year expectancy, and then you get a value indication. So whether you're able to stabilize multiple years or a single year, the idea is the same, and that's how we've approached our cap rates. And we also note that the cap rate would be influenced by the perceived risk, investor expectations for appreciation, and required returns on other vehicles. If you turn to page 4, this is some appraisal discussion on cap rates, and the idea is it has to go beyond just a data entry and go to what the purchaser might expect to be getting when they purchase the property, and that involves a principle of anticipation, which we utilize in our calculations. So if you go to page 6, we have an overview of the assessor's cap rates. They have quite a wide range, up to 7.95%. And then we summarize the broker information. So for low-rise properties, for the most part, they're starting at 5. CBRE is a bit more optimistic, and we're seeing more minimal compression in the cap rates. If you go to page 10, we discuss some factors that we might consider for adjustment. So for the property at hand, we're not doing any adjustments, but later in the docket, we do have some social housing properties where we are considering adjustments for durability and quality of income, as well as things like condition, but the description of all the factors are here. The idea is anything that poses a risk to the income of the property should warrant some sort of adjustment. And then on page 12, we have our cap rates. So our newest property would be 2390 McPhillips. And the important thing with 2390 McPhillips as well is that in the broker flyer, when they were marketing this property, based on the NOI that they stated, along with the price it actually sold for, that would indicate a 5% cap rate, which is what we're asking for in this property. And then we have all of our calculations to follow. And then I'll just go back to the main brief just to wrap up the presentation here. So back to the main brief, page 20, I have an appendix. That's where I have some photos where you could see kind of what the typical unit of the apartment style and the townhouse style looks like. So you could see fairly modern. And then I've also included the financials that we've looked at. And that would conclude my presentation on this property. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cates. Questions, Mr. Michalak?
Yeah, so it appears like my adjusted expenses are pretty much in line with yours. So there's really the only issue here seems like the vacancy application where I had used actual. So you had stated that even though the property has been historically performing at around 1% vacancy, you've decided to put it to 3.1. That's correct?
That's correct. We use a market vacancy for the apartments we look at unless it's showing a chronic issue of above market vacancy, chronic being over multi-year, and then I might consider an upward adjustment. But yes, I would use a market vacancy for all apartments typically.
Outside of that, I don't have any questions anymore relating to this property. I'll reserve it for questions about the cap rate study.
All right, I thank you. Ms. Knight, any questions?
Just in regards to the cap rate study, do you want me to ask that now or later?
Go ahead.
The cap rate for McPhillips, you've got 5.59 with the same purchase price, 19.4. So how did you get 5.59?
So in terms of this property for McPhillips, we could go to the calculations. Let me locate that. So we have the calculations on page 21 of the cap rate study, and then some background on what we did on page 22. So 2390 McPhillips is a fairly new property. We noted that they purchased this property with below market rents. It was purchased by a REIT. They would have been fairly knowledgeable. So what we've done is we've stabilized the income based on CMHC rents, given that it was purchased with below market income. And by below market, I mean it was, $100, $200 below what we might expect. So in terms of a 5.59 for a new property, I would say that would be on the high end. That's not what I would use for this property that we're looking at. But I would say that it should at least be in the 5% range. And we've just offered an alternate stabilization for this property. But yeah, more details too on page 22 in terms of those actual rents that are coming from CMHC and the vacancy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Questions, Mr. Stephenson?
So you're referring to actual rents or not actual rents on this property on McPhillips. You're referring to the adjusted rents that you've done, and that's what you've entered into your data that you're providing? The adjusted rents to determine the cap rate that you're showing us here?
Yes.
Were there any other properties involved with the sale of 23 McPhillips that you know of when the REIT was purchasing, or?
Not to our knowledge, I don't believe so.
Okay, no further questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I just have one quick question, Ms. Cates. You mentioned that this property was adjacent to a rail line.
Yes.
Is that the CN main line?
Yeah, I wish I could, to be honest, I'm not sure of the specifics. I just noted that from the overview and the assessment page that it was indicating a rail line.
Okay. Whereabouts is it in relation? I know that you said you inspected the property.
Yeah, so when we look at the aerial photo on page 6,
Mhm.
then you could see to the left in that kind of skinnier parcel, I believe that would be the rail line, because on the assessment main page, it indicates that has a rail line influence. So I would assume it would be that thinner parcel to the left.
All right, I thank you. That's all my questions. And you have rebuttal?
Yes, I do. I wasn't sure if Mr. Mikulik was going to ask any questions on the cap rate study or kind of made a comment, but if we're good, then yeah, I could go on with the rebuttal.
All right, I'll ask Mr. Mikulik, did you have any questions on the cap rate study?
Yeah, so, I guess, regarding 2390 McPhillips, that, like, those rents are, like, did you actually look at what their 2020, or sorry, I guess if this sold in 2020, do you know what their 2021 actual reported gross income was?
No, we don't have access to that information, as this isn't a property that we work.
Okay, so you would say that that's an assumption that's been applied and it wasn't really based on actual reported information?
Yeah, the rent used is not necessarily based on actual reported, since we didn't have access to that, but in terms of the cap rate calculations, it would be an assumption. There are some assumptions that may be required. The idea would be, what is the income stream they're expecting to purchase, not necessarily what was in place, if it's changing. Sometimes properties remain fairly steady and then the historical and the next year is, fairly similar. But in
Right.
this case, we know that it changed, and we saw that in the ads after purchase that they did raise the rents quite a bit. But no, I don't have access to the 2021 mailer.
And then just so regarding some of these other properties here, like, so did you guys stabilize the income on these? All the cap sales?
When you say other properties, are you just referring to like all of the remaining?
Yeah, so these Altus capitalization rate sales, you guys stabilize the income on them?
Yeah, we stabilize these. So what we'll do is, if we have the information from the owner, we'll use that. If not, we'll also look to what the market is offering on the property. So for example, like in a lot of broker flyers, they'll speak of what the rent that can be attained. So like I know for Talbot, they had in the broker flyer what the average rent was. They indicated it could even be more than that. And there are professional obligations with those, so they can't really be stating rents that cannot be attained at all for the property. So yeah, I would say we do a stabilization with a combination of owner information, market information, stuff that would be available to the purchaser.
Just so like I just have a few questions, I guess. So the one on 677 Maryland, your suites, you're basing $813 per unit rents, right?
Yeah, for 677 Maryland, I was able to reach out to the purchaser and he had sent me the financials for the property that the vendor had provided to him. So
Okay.
that property was experiencing quite a bit of vacancy, but no one's going to purchase a property expecting to run it at 30% vacancy. So we did make some assumptions based on the financials that he provided. And yeah, so that's what we extrapolated for the rents for Maryland.
Okay, so page 68 would show that for Maryland, you only used 14 out of 32 units to calculate the average monthly rent. Is that correct?
Well, this property had a very high amount of vacancy, so yeah, we used what was available and then got an average rent to apply as like a gross potential.
Is it fair to say that with multiple different levels of rent in the building, that those vacant units being not having a value attributed to them, that number could fluctuate quite a bit if you factored in all the units?
Like when there is a different suite mix at the property, then the rents will vary, but these type of properties are under rent control, so they can only vary so much. And that's kind of part of the analysis. You know, if you're looking at valuing some of these properties and they have really high vacancy, you're still gonna have to come to a gross potential. I mean, and the best indication for a property like this that would be under rent control would be what they're attaining.
And so going forward here, 738 St. Mary's, property taxes, only listing $3,000 on page 69 on the stabilization. Are you aware that the property taxes on page 73 list the property at 15,613? And so
Yeah.
that would increase the expenses?
Yeah, for 738 St. Mary's, we used what was reported for the expenses, but it was brought to our attention that the taxes were low.
Okay.
So yes, I'm aware that the taxes, when we look at the taxes after rebate, it probably should be something closer to 13,000 based on our calculations. So yes.
Did you recalculate the cap rate on that?
Yeah, based on a rough recalculation, it would come in sub 5, I think around 4.7.
Okay. And then I guess 150 Hendon, I know there's been a lot of questions on either side of the table. So you had stated that when I look at 150, sorry, I shouldn't say you had stated, but when we look at the evidence provided for 150 Hendon, you, or not you, but Altus, it says there was rental board increases at the time of sale?
Yes, we were able to interview the purchaser and they had indicated that the vendor had applied for RTB increases.
Okay.
And that wasn't finalized at the time of sale, but it was reasonably expected that they would come in. Property transacted, I believe, June 1st and then, or June 2nd, sorry. And then the RTB orders were then backdated to June 1st. So yes, they expected the rents to increase at that property.
So would an owner apply for RTB increase? They would be basing it on high expenses, right? Like what they're incurring maybe for repair maintenance.
Yeah, typically the RTB increases if they're putting in funds to fix up the units or renovate, possibly even some of the common areas, then they're able to apply for RTB increases. So it's not necessarily for all expenses, but when they're doing upgrades, then they can apply in order to get kind of more what they feel the market rent would be for that unit.
Okay, so yeah, because I'm just looking on page 20. So repair and maintenance for Hendon starts in 2017 at 53,803, then goes 59,397. Then we see a jump of almost double for 2019 and 2020 right before it sells. Like, are you aware if the property's been renovated at all, or where maybe that repair and maintenance would have gone with the property, or like, are you aware of condition of the suites, that sort of thing at the time of sale?
So in terms of if the property's been renovated, I would believe that at least at least some of the units have been renovated based on the RTB in
Okay.
terms of where all of those funds went, based like a detailed itemization. I don't have access to that. I see what you're saying with the repair and maintenance going up. I agree. But when we look at kind of a 4-year average, 1,400 a unit would kind of be within range, maybe even a bit on the low side. So I think it's still fairly reasonable to apply.
Would it be fair to say, though, that they got those RTB increases because of that repair and maintenance in 2020 and 2019? So you should weight the repair and maintenance higher in those years as opposed to averaging?
Well, the typical treatment for repair and maintenance that we would do would be to do a 5-year average, less if we have less years. So no, I'm comfortable with the average. That's how we typically would treat properties.
Okay, you know what? Those are all my questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And Ms. Cates, you have rebuttal.
Yes, on the cap rates.
All right. If you would like to proceed to that.
Okay, let me just. Okay, so on the rebuttal, on page 2, we have an overview of the city's cap rates. They have a range of 3.46 to 5.74%. We note that at the time of the reference date, the interest rates on a government bond, 4.5%. So we feel that cap rates that are coming in lower than that, it kind of just presents a logical question of why would the same purchaser invest in multifamily property, which would be moderate to high risk, if they could get a low risk government bond for a lower rate. On page 4, we look at 727 Sargent and 241 Young. These are 2 examples of these very low end sales. We don't really see cap rates like this in the Winnipeg market, 3.46, 4.21%. It typically indicates that the purchaser is actually purchasing a different income opportunity, since these are very low for this market here. For 459 Sargent, the city has used all the historicals in their calculation, but we note that the market information that would have been available to the purchaser indicates a rent of $740 per unit, as well as $40 per month in parking. And when we recalculate this cap rate, which I have on page 5, we get cap rate in the 5.7 range, which would make more sense considering the type of property and the location. On page 7, we have the discussion on 150 Hendon. This property, the city has stabilized at 4.01%. This is artificially low for this type of property. Based on some of the points brought out in questioning, the purchaser expected to achieve a different income stream. In 2021, when they had only been operating for a partial year, they put a gross potential of $712,000. And then in the following year, when they were operating for that entire year, they achieved something very similar. And when we restabilize, that's coming in at around a 5.4%, and that's on page 8. Then if you go to, just skip ahead to page 22, 677 Maryland, the city is using the older sale. There is a more current sale almost right at the reference date to use, and so that would be more accurate. 2390 McPhillips, while I wouldn't say we should be applying, 5.5s to new properties, what I think it does suggest is an alternate stabilization. That shows that these new properties should be around a 5. And like I said, the broker information was showing that with the NOI that they were advertising in the marketing circular, with the actual sale price, that would be at about a 5. And then there's just some commentary on 700 St. Mary's and 32 Arden, just talking about intention to renovate. And that would conclude my rebuttal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cates. Any questions, Mr. Mikulik?
No, you know what? I think I covered it kind of with questions in my analysis of their cap rate study. I'm just gonna leave it at that for now.
All right, I thank you. And Ms. Knight, questions?
No, thank you.
And Mr. Stephenson?
No questions.
And I also have no questions. Does either party have a wish for a summation on this property?
You know what, I can reserve some summation more kind of towards the end, if that's okay.
That's fine. Ms. Cates?
Yeah, I'm good as well. Thank you.
All right. I'm just going to ask panel, are you all okay to continue at this point? Or
Yeah.
would you like to proceed to the next property? Or
Okay.
take a break, sorry.
I'm good.
All right, Mr. Stephenson?
Yes, I'm okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. We are going to proceed then to item number 4, which is 5 Lake Crest Road. And-
Oh. Perfect. We have file number 24-1492, roll number 030-679-89900, 5 Lake Crest Road, roll year 2025, assessed value 15,379,000, classification 20, liability taxable. I do have another recommendation for this property after I've looked into it further leading up to the hearing.
right.
So could I present that?
Yes, please, thank you.
Okay, so it would be a recommendation to reduce the value to 14,104,000. And that would be based on a 768,678 net operating income.
Sorry, what was that number again?
Yeah,
768,
Yeah.
678.
Okay.
678,
Yeah,
thank you.
and then a 5.45% cap rate to get that recommendation. Would that be accepted?
Yes, Ms. Cates, would that be accepted or no?
I believe we're, again, just too far apart, so I would like to proceed. Thank
All
you.
right, thank you.
Okay, I can continue on and I'll touch on where I did the recommendation as we proceed along through the property, if that's okay.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, so we have a 4-building with 2-story walk-ups. There, I guess, like you could classify them as sort of a garden style apartments, built in 1977 with 96 suites. We have the location being in Waverly Heights neighborhood, so close, like similar type of quadrant of the city here, where it's a pretty good neighborhood. You do get fairly good clientele renting in this area, close to the university, close to amenities, so a pretty good spot location-wise. We have the number of units here being 41 bedroom, 42 bedroom, 16 3-bedroom. And then regarding the cap rate involved, we have application of 5.45% for this one. Now regarding the income adjustment, I just wanted to touch on, so if you go to page 13, and then where you see their gross rents, but then you see here on page 14 with their income statements. So I was basically doing a revised effective gross income based on what's been reported in 2020. So that revised effective gross income being 1,416,812. And then for the expenses, I used a total number of 648,134, and that was looking through the reported expenses that had been done, and so it was upping their management fees a little bit because it wasn't at the 5% level, and then adjusting and in that 648,134, the repair and maintenance works out to about 27.46 per unit. And that was basically taking the maintenance line item there. You see there's page 14, there's a maintenance line item in the top box down kind of near the bottom. And then taking major repair and replacement, we allocated about 20% because when we did look at that, there is stuff that we would say classify that could be considered capital. So we did look at it, but say, you know what, we'll give a little bit of grace that some of that could still be into repair and maintenance. And so that was what came out with the expenses. So that came out when you factor in the effective gross income and expenses to 768,678. And then just going back to touch on the cap rate, we're at 5.45. I think cap rate, like totally reasonable again, given what we feel is quality evidence supplied for our cap rates. And when you look on page 8, the type of property that it is, page 8 and 9, you could see there is some variability in the suites. So page 8, page 9 would show suite maybe look a little more older per se, but well kept. And then they do have some that are renovated. If you look at page 10, the ones that have been updated. And when I was on their website looking, they do list that they do offer rental discounts, but not for the suites that have been renovated. So it feels like this is a situation where there is renovation on turnover, which would be leading to why expenses are being reported quite high. And so, I mean, we factored in 20% out of that major repair and replacement to count towards repair and maintenance. But that other amount, we feel that based on how this property looks like it's transitioning, that would also include capital improvements in that item, or line item. And you can see they offer a pool for the tenants as well to use. Grounds are fairly well kept. Again, we reflected that in the repair maintenance by applying a pretty significant amount on this property now. Again, cap rate too, we feel that for 5.45, totally reasonable. We're at the higher end of our cap rate range on this one. You could see based on the pictures that the property seems well kept. It's pretty clean. They are doing updates, I assume, as tenants move out. I don't have that exact number for you, but that's what it looks like. And so we feel that with the recommendation of my new number, factoring in the lower net operating income and the cap rate where it is, that we're perfectly acceptable on this one. And that would conclude my presentation.
Thank you. Any questions, Ms. Cates?
Yes, thank you. So I know you made a rec where you did some adjustments to the NOI, but just because they're included just on page 4 with the rent comps.
Mhm.
Are you aware that the rents shown here are not reflective of the rents after discount and incentive, and the rents would actually be in the 1,100, 1,200 range for these properties?
Yeah, like that's why I reduced it to what I did, looking at what they reported. I mean, I know there's significant discounts involved. I lean to not wanting to include them, but we do, for the sake that I guess that's what they're getting at the time, even though they can be removed at any moment yearly on lease renewal. But I did reduce it based on their lower rents.
But when you say they could be removed at any moment, would you not agree that if you have a sophisticated property manager or owner and they could be removed, then they would be doing so? So the reason they're actually in place is because they can't get those maximums that they're approved for the units?
I think that they are being removed as the suites get updated, judged by how they market the property, where the renovated units aren't applicable to receiving discounts.
Okay, and then You also made a comment about the expenses being high, possibly because they're doing renovations on turnover. But would you agree that for garden style apartments, they typically run higher expenses, specifically repair and maintenance, just because of all those individual elements they have to maintain at these type of properties?
No, I think I've reflected that, and I mean, that repair and maintenance 2746 that I worked up. I mean, that was right in line, I think, even with what Altus was projecting in their repair and maintenance studies in prior years. So I don't for garden style apartments. So I really have no issue with how that number was achieved.
Okay. Thank you. That would conclude my questions on this property.
I thank you. And Ms. Knight, any questions?
Yeah, what's the new expense rate?
Like, you want to know like the percentage ratio?
Yeah,
Let me just calculate it for you. I didn't have that off the top of my head. I just had the phone number. So it'd be 45.75%.
and that's 648, 134.
Yeah,
Okay, and then the rent was 1416812.
yeah,
The NOI 768,678
that's correct.
for a total of 14104. And then the new rent would be 1229.87.
Yeah, you know what? I didn't calculate rent per unit at that point, but I just based it on.
I just took the 1416812
that would
divided
be-
by 96. Okay,
Yeah, that's fair.
all right, thank you.
Mr. Stephenson,
No questions, thank you.
thank you. So this is all model driven except for the change you made, correct?
Yeah, the income would have been model driven. The cap rate would still be, in this case, model applied cap rate.
Right, okay. And you did not inspect this property yourself?
No, I have not.
Okay. Do you have any notes on when it was last inspected?
I don't unfortunately have that information.
Okay. And this property is 47 years old, correct?
That is correct, yeah. Built
Yeah.
in 1977.
And I'm just wondering, you have spoke about the suites being renovated as they turn over, but do you know the percentage of suites that have been renovated?
Yeah, no, that's where I wasn't able to, I didn't have that information. It was solely basing it on how they marketed the property on their website, where they had different levels of rent, but they had a disclaimer saying that these rent discounts don't apply to renovated units.
All right. I thank you. Ms. Cates, if you would like to proceed with your brief.
Thank you. So if you turn to page 2, we have our requested assessment of $11,747,000. On page 6, we have some property maps. And then some exterior photographs on page 7 and 8, so you could get a sense of the size of the property. On page 9, we have a property description. So the subject is on Lake Crest Road between Chancellor Drive and Waverly Street in the Waverly Heights area. There are 4 two-story garden-style buildings built in the 70s. There are 96 units, 114 surface parking stalls, and there is an outdoor pool available to the tenants, which is typical of garden-style properties. If you go to page 14, we have the overview of our income approach. So we are applying potential market gross rents of $1,385,031 or $1,202 per unit per month based on the actual stabilized income for the property. We are applying a market vacancy of 3.1%. And for the expenses, we are applying an expense allowance of $720,556 or 51.6% of effective gross income based on a 3-year stabilization of the expenses, along with a 5-year stabilization of the repair and maintenance. The repair and maintenance of these type of properties is high. That's the nature of these properties because they have a lot of elements to maintain. So when you're looking at garden style apartments, they're all wood frame. They'll typically have wood balconies, staircases, and then they have individual systems to maintain at each unit, which would include things like hot water tank, heat, AC, laundry. So it is typical. So where we might see for a vertical apartment, like a standard apartment, where we might see repair and maintenance more in the range of maybe 1,800 to maybe 2,200. It's not uncommon to see for these garden style that you're getting into the high 2,000, low 3,000 per unit because of just the features of this type of property. So if you go to page 15, we have our cap rate. So based on our cap rate study, we have a base cap rate of 5.5%. And given the features of this property, the construction style, the amount of units on the site, or buildings on the site, I should say, and the fact that it requires regular significant investment to keep them in good condition, we are applying a slight premium of 5.75%, mostly based on the garden style aspect. So if you go to page 17, we have our income and expense breakdown for the property. So we have our official market gross rents of $1,385,031. This is after discounts. When you have sophisticated management ownership of properties, if they could have less discounts, they would. The discounts are in place because they're not able to achieve the full rents of their units without the vacancy getting completely out of control. This is pretty common this is pretty common across properties that they will have to offer pretty significant discounts, especially as they're doing renovations on the units. So when accounting for the other forms of income, we have an effective gross income of $1,395,997. Our total expenses, including $31.34 in repair and maintenance, would be $720,556 for a 51.6% expense ratio. When we're looking at properties from the 70s, especially of this style, it wouldn't be uncommon to see expenses in the mid 50% to 60% range. 51.6% is actually pretty low expense ratio for this type of property, even though the R&M is on the higher end. So we have a net operating income of $675,441 with a 5.75% cap rate, gives an indicated value of $11,747,000. We have our repair and maintenance on page 18 for your review. So there does tend to be some disagreement in terms of our position versus the city's position on what constitutes capital. So capital expenditures, so when you're looking at a standard apartment, typically if you replace the roof or you replace the hot water tank, those items are considered to be good for 20 years or, you know, whatever that appropriate time limit is. But when we're looking at properties like this, things that might be considered capital in those type of properties would not necessarily be capital here, because if you have all of these units, all of this to maintain, even if you replace one hot water tank at a property, you're still going to have all these other units to replace. So what we've done with this is we've looked at their detailed accounting of where these items are going. So we've captured more of what the assessor has removed as the major repair and replacement. We're capturing more of that here based on the detailed breakdown, but still accounting for outliers and taking those out as necessary. So you can see where we've done some adjustments here, and that is how we get to our stabilized average. On page 20 is the start of our appendix. I've included some marketing photos so you can see there's a mix across the units of finishes. Typically with this property manager, they might have some units of their properties that are completely renovated, others that are original, and then others that are somewhere in between where they will do some renovations upon turnover, but not an entire overhaul of the unit. So I would tend to believe that there's a good mix of this property, though I've not confirmed the specifics of how many units are fully renovated versus partial. Sometimes those figures are a bit hard to break out on their end. And then I've also included the financials that we've reviewed. And that would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cates. Mr. Mikulak, any questions?
Yeah, I guess so. Just on page 18, when we discuss the repair and maintenance, I get totally what your position is in terms of the HVAC needing to be replaced. However, I'm just looking at, in terms of the line items, the bulk of the repair and maintenance for all these items come from flooring replacement, appliance replacement, painting, counters, cupboards, and cabinetry work up to combine for like 75,000. HVAC mechanicals about 9,911. So I guess that's where you would still be of the mind that those line items that are contributing to the updating of suites wouldn't be included as capital, and you would include that in repair and maintenance still?
Yes, when we look, because when we look at this property, it has 96 units. And if we look at the figures, they are, like, if we look at, you know, flooring or appliances, like, they are fairly consistent with what they're reporting over time. So with the amount of units, even if you replace the flooring in some parts of the unit, some of the appliances, you still have all of these other units to replace. So I have removed outliers in terms of like painting those high amounts in 21 and 22. I've taken those out of the analysis. But for the others, I feel like they're fairly consistent in the ranges that they're reporting. So I don't believe that's capital, because capital will be a blip one year where it's very high. And then you know that that's not going to be every single year. But when we look at this over 5 years, we can see what's consistent, what might be less consistent.
Is it not fair that the company who's been running it for many years, has said we're just allocating percentages of capital aside every year to put that into updating suites? Is that not a fair comment to say?
I would say yes, the Rancho has been operating this for some time. I'm not sure if I'm getting what you're meaning by putting a certain amount of capital.
Well, just in that you had said it has to be a blip, but if they're investing into their property by updating the suites on turnover, wouldn't you say though that you can still spread those capital expenditures over multiple years?
But I think there's just a fundamental disagreement on what's capital expenditures and what's not. If they have 96 units that they're slowly upgrading over time, then that's not going to be capital. If you know that every year you're having to put 15,000-20,000 towards flooring, and that's consistent over multiple years, then it's not capital that should be removed. If it's consistent, the idea with removing capital is that it's not something that a future purchaser would expect to have to do again in the recent term if you just replaced, the roof.
Those are all my questions. Thank you.
I thank you. Ms. Knight, any questions? Diane, Ms.
I
Knight?
was coughing and I forgot I was on mute. Sorry, no
Oh my
questions. Thank
gosh.
you.
Are you all right?
Yeah, I just have a cold. Okay.
So I'm sorry, no questions? All right, thank you. And Mr. Stephenson,
No questions, thank you.
thank you. Just one, Ms. Cates, you didn't happen to inspect this property, did you?
I did not.
Okay, and I believe you stated earlier that you do not know the percentage of suites that have been renovated on this property?
Yeah, I don't have the percentages. I found sometimes with these properties where they don't fully renovate, where they're doing, some fully, some partial, it is hard to get those figures of exactly what is what, but I don't have the figures to break those out today.
Yeah, that's fine. I just wanted to verify you had stated that. Thank you. I have no other questions. Does either party wish for a summation on this property?
No, I don't need summation. Thank you.
I'm good as well. Thank you.
All right. And I think now at this time, we are going to take a 10-minute recess.
Thank you.
I thank you. I would like to call this hearing back to order. We are going to move on to item number 6 on the docket, which is 21 Newdale Avenue. And we are looking at assessed value on this property. And Mr. Mikulik, whenever you're ready to proceed.
We have file number 24-1792. Roll number 030-603-00100, 21 Newdale Avenue. Roll year 2025. Assessed value 6,914,000. Classification 20. Liability T. We have one building, 5 stories, apartment built in 1976, 68 suites. We see that on page 2, this is a not-profit organization, Sam Properties. You could see there was a sale they purchased off Manitoba Housing in 2018 for 7.650 million. We're located on South Pembina, which is, again, it's a good location. From that regard, close to amenities, easy access, for if you have to get public transportation, etc. And when we see here the total number of units being 68, it's broken down between 62 bedroom and 8 1-bedrooms. It is a predominantly 2-bedroom facility. We have a gross potential rent here of 790,174, which would break down to 968.35 per unit. Less vacancy and expenses at 51.69%. You get a net operating income of 369,900. Capitalization rate 5.35% to get your 6,914,000. And rent comparables here on page 4. So just to give you an idea, it is nonprofit. So you could see where it falls in line with other rent comps in the area. We're at 968.35, being with predominantly 2-bedroom units, and then you can see where other like market apartments would fall in. Now, these market apartments, I would say, are probably below market rents as well. And then when you look at the CMHC analysis that I provided further on page 4 into page 5, that you know, at a market rent level for this location, it would be looking at 1,136,000 yearly potential rent at full market. We're at 69.54%. So we have reflected again this type of nature of property, that it is lower income, it is a nonprofit, and we've also reflected that in the expense ratio being 51.69%. I think is higher than what market evidence would show based on the cap sales that have been provided. And when you look at the cap rate we had touched on already, we're at 5.35 here. So we don't feel like we're being totally unreasonable in that application regarding that. Now, when you look at the description of the property, which I've included, so it just says on page 9, Newdale is an affordable housing complex located just off Pembina Highway in Richmond West, located near grocery stores, bus routes, restaurants. 1 and 2-bedroom units are available with air conditioning, select units, and outdoor parking. Fairly common that you would see that in these type of properties, with air conditioning not being available on all of them. Some don't have any, some might have as well, but you could see they have different rental options as well, which would be, they got a social housing program, affordable housing program, market housing program. And when you go to page 11 and you see their reported income, you could see that from the revenue side, the amount of subsidies that they're getting, which would be provided, I assume, through Manitoba Housing at this point, to basically contribute to the operations here of this. And then just again, the list of the expenses involved with the property. Again, we've reflected above market expenses in this instance with the below market rents. And I think the cap rate is probably on a little bit of the higher range for us, given the nature of this property as well. You could really look at this and say cap rate in a market scenario could be closer to, 5.1%, that sort of thing. So I don't feel like we've overextended here. And again, it's sold through Manitoba Housing for 7,650,000. And we know Manitoba Housing, they are bound by their act where if they want to dispose or purchase a property, they're bound by the Land Value Appraisal Commission to produce a fair market value when they sell. So it's pretty typical that housing will have to get an appraisal done by a third party to determine what a fair value would mean. And so that's what we see in terms of what's come across our desks here for these type of properties. So we don't feel we're out of line with the 6,914,000. It still reflects the characteristics of the nature of this style of property. And so that would conclude my presentation today. Thank you.
I thank you. Questions, Ms. Cates?
Yes, thank you. So regarding page 2, where you're discussing the sale, are you aware that typically when Manitoba Housing is selling properties to other social housing agencies, that they have a lot of atypical conditions in place, such as forgivable loans, which would then make the sale not really a true market transaction?
I would challenge that in the sense that they need to produce a value that's typically done by outsourcing an appraisal. And are you aware of any of those appraisals that have happened?
Okay, and are you also aware that property sold as part of a portfolio of Manitoba Housing properties?
Well, they put a sworn value on this property, so they've signed off, lawyers have signed off on, and government officials have made clear that the value should be 7,650,000. So I don't see an adjustment to the property being made.
Okay. On page 3, your income value summary, is the model valuing this as if it's social housing, or is it valuing it as if it were a market apartment on the low end of the rental range?
I would say the capitalization rate would be valuing it as a model-driven market apartment. Now, when I look at this on a site-specific level, I think that, I mean, if you really wanted to narrow it down, you could make a case that a market level would be slightly lower cap rate of 5.35, but for this case in the model application, I think it's gone a little bit on the higher end, and so I'm comfortable with the way that cap rates have been applied. But the income parameters would be reflective of the lower socioeconomic situation.
Right, so the income is on the low end, like it's turned down in the model, but everything else, like vacancy, expenses, cap rate, are all market, are they not?
Expenses, I would say we're above market there at 51.69, and rents were way below, so I think we've adjusted this enough.
And then, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just saying I think we adjusted it enough to where it needs to be.
And then on page 4 with your rent comps, I thought I heard you say during your presentation that these market comps were below market. If that is what was stated, how is it that they would be below market if several comps are all within the same range and these properties are under rent control based on their age? So, like, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it was just based on the data I provided from the CMHC table, right? So when you look at the CMHC zone and you see what the CMHC average monthly rents are for 1 and 2 bedroom, you can make a case that these ones aren't right at market level. And I mean, there's different properties that are higher than this, but I felt that I couldn't really get any that were lower that I was searching for. So that's where.
Do you feel it's accurate to say that they are below market when the CMHC zone data is including all types of properties, newer properties, renovated properties. Like these comps would be under rent control, so do you think that's really fair to even say?
Well, I think it's just fair to use that as further support to show that we reflected how below market we are in this situation. So that's kind of how I would be looking at it, that we don't need to adjust it down further.
Okay. And then regarding the CMHC, where you're highlighting that it's below CMHC data, given that the subject property is social housing with low end finishes and the different things that we know come with social housing, does it makes sense for it to be below CMHC, does it not?
100% it does. And again, I provide this evidence as a guide to show the applicant and the panel that we are being more than reasonable in applying an income analysis here.
Thank you. That would conclude my questions.
Thank you. And Mr. Stephenson, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Knight?
No, ma'am.
I also have no questions. If you would like to proceed, Ms. Cates?
Thank you. So if you turn to page 2, we have our requested assessment of $5,274,000. On page 6, we have our property maps. And then some exterior photographs on page 7. Property description on page 8. So it is on Newdale Avenue, west of Pembina, in the Richmond West area. It is a 5-story building built in the mid-70s. There are 68 units, 68 parking stalls, and it is adjacent to a rail line. If you turn to page 13, we have the overview of our income approach. We are not relying on the sale information. When you have a social housing property for Manitoba Housing that's transacting to another social housing agency, those sales aren't at market. They come along with a variety of conditions, such as forgivable loans, other types of allowances. So the price is not based on the actual market price of that property, and they're not reliable to try to get value out of there. So in terms of the rent, the property is social housing. It operates on a rent geared to income basis, meaning people are paying what they can based on a defined proportion of their income. So the rents are not at market. So given that we know that the model for social housing properties typically will take rents based on a proportion of CMHC, we're not disputing the rents in this case. But I would note that the rents that we're applying are quite a bit higher than what they actually achieve for the property and the history of the property. For instance, these units might get $300 a month in rent. So while we are applying a low end market rent, that's still a lot higher than what this property has ever shown to be able to achieve. So those rents would be $790,174 or $968 per unit per month. We've also applied a market vacancy of 3.1%. For the expenses, we were able to review a couple of years of expense data. So we have applied $449,241 or 58.7% of effective gross income. That is based on a 2-year stabilization of operating expenses and 3 years of repair and maintenance. On page 14 and 15, we have some discussion regarding how we approach cap rates for social housing. From the text, valuation and market studies for affordable housing, Richard Polton discusses the idea that to develop a cap rate, you start at a market rate and you adjust upwards for risk factors. He breaks the risk factors into more detailed categories, but essentially they can be classified into broad categories of low quality construction, advanced age, declining neighborhood, and low income tenancy. So if you go to page 16, there's some discussion on the impact of low income tenancy. And to summarize, it's based on the relationship with deferred maintenance. These properties don't earn enough operating revenues to cover their operating expenses. They rely on funding to bridge that gap and stay operational. But where they don't have the funds is then for those preventative repair and maintenance items that market apartments are able to do. And what happens is these issues build up over time. and the severity of those issues build up, and then you could end up easily with hundreds of thousands of dollars of deferred capital work for the properties. In speaking with the owner of this property, he mentioned that they had about $1 million in deferred capital regarding plumbing, drain lines. So I have a case study here from 185 Smith, where it kind of shows what happens. These properties that are built in the 70s, if they're not getting the maintenance and repair that they need, then they end up having major problems. This specific property flooded due to water pipe issue, and they ended up, all the tenants had to evacuate. They ended up selling this property because of the high amount of repair and maintenance that would have been required to bring it back up to standard. So if you go to page 18, we have our cap rate for this subject property. We are applying a cap rate of 6%. That would be based on our base cap rate of 5.5%, and then adjustments to account for the fact that it is social housing and there is deferred capital required at the property. If you go to page 20, we have our income and expense breakdown. So we have an effective gross income of $765,679 with total expenses of $449,241, which includes repair and maintenance at $1,067 per unit, which would be on the low end, but social housing properties, if they don't have the funds to put into repair and maintenance, that might be expected. So that's what they're reporting, that's what we're using, but I would suggest that it is low. So we have a net operating income of $316,438 with a 6% cap rate, gives an indicated value of $5,274,000 rounded. And further support for this approach, there are prior board decisions which suggest that even with low rents, you could still have higher expenses and a cap rate premium may still be warranted. So the idea that simply adjusting the rents downward is enough to capture the risks with social housing is not sufficient in our view. So our appendix starts on page 23, and then we just included some of the financials that we were able to review, as well as some of the further documentation for the social housing adjustments. And that would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions, Mr. Michalek?
You know what? I have no questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Knight, any questions?
No, ma'am.
And Mr. Stephenson?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted some clarification on something I thought you said, Ms. Cates. Did you say this property was sold by Manitoba Housing because of this flood?
No, sorry, that was a different property. I was just using
All right.
185 Smith as like a bit of a case study in what happens to properties of this age group where they have deferred maintenance. But in terms of this specific property, it was sold by Manitoba Housing, but not based on any type of major issues as far as I'm aware.
All right, thank you. Does either party have a wish for a summation?
No, I'm okay, thank you.
I'm good as well, thank you.
All right, I thank you both. We'll move on to the last item on our docket, which is item number 8, 2900 Pembina Highway. And again, we are looking at assessed value. And Mr. Michalek, whenever you are ready.
Good. We have file number 24-1793, roll number 030-413-45100, 2900 Pembina Highway. This is another nonprofit style of housing, as we have a assessed value $7,800,000.
Madam Chair,
Yes,
it's a little hard to hear the assessor. Maybe.
yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
That's better. Thank you.
Okay. So we have roll year 2025, assessed value $7,800,000, classification 40, as this property is school tax exempt based on the ownership. And so we have one building that's 6 stories, built in 1974 with 95 suites. It's located right down the street from the prior one we just discussed, but this one's on Pembina Highway. So again, close, easy access for amenities, good neighborhood, that sort of thing. And when you look at our income value summary here on page 3, we have the average monthly rent at $788.84. This being 33 bachelor suites, 55 1-bedroom, and only 7 2-bedrooms. So the average rent per unit obviously would go down, being that we are having smaller units here. And that works out to our gross potential rent of $899,278. Less the vacancy, you get your effective gross income, you could see there, and the expense ratio 52.11 to get our net operating income. And again, same cap rate, 5.35% that we were just discussing prior to this. So that gets you the 7,800,000. And again, rent comparables here. So on page 4, just the rent comps, you could see where we're coming in 788.84. I know none of these rent comps have bachelor suites, but again, it's tough to find units with rents and bachelors that are coming in this low. So again, just to illustrate, we feel that we've done a reasonable job reflecting the income situation here for this property, and also with the expenses being what they are, 52.11, again, above what you would see in typical market cap sales. Cap rate, again, we touched on. I don't have to go through that again. And then just the description on page 9 showing what this property is. So Richmond Gardens provides affordable, safe, clean, secure housing for people over 55. Located in Fort Richmond, the property offers residents a variety of social activities, multi-purpose room, and on-site laundry. You could see that they have the rental options listed here. So they got bachelor 1, 2 bedrooms. They do offer, like I said, the subsidies. I don't know on the reporting, it doesn't state information I have of how much of a subsidy they're getting. But you could see where their rents line up, 623 through 93. I don't know if that includes a subsidy or not, but and then the expenses listed, and then the 2021 expenses as well. They kind of changed their reporting around, so it's hard to really gain a consistent, I guess, balance for the expenses. But I mean, we do reflect that these type of properties again would be higher than market regular expense ratio. And we reflected the rents being below, like you can see where they're coming in terms of market comps and CMHC data. So again, we feel that we're totally reasonable there.
Mr. Michalak, I'm starting to have difficulty hearing you again.
Is it break? Can you hear me now?
It's
Okay.
you're just a little garbled. I wonder if it's because you're moving slightly, or you have your hand near your mouth, or you're not close enough to the microphone. Any one of those.
Okay.
Thank you.
But yeah, no, anyway, that would just conclude my presentation. I was just wrapping up, and so we feel that we're acceptable here with the value. That's 7,800,000.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Pates, any questions?
Yes, thank you. So given that it's seniors housing and it has limited parking and a higher proportion of really small units, would you agree that that may be less desirable to the market?
Potentially. I don't have an exact adjustment that could be applied based on that, because it's hard to say what type of cap evidence you would be able to show to make that adjustment. It's potentially there.
Okay, thank you. That would conclude my new questions for this property.
Thank you. And Ms. Knight?
Really, the biggest difference is your expenses and your cap rate, correct?
Between the applicant?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so that would be the issue.
And the expenses are pretty close, correct?
Yeah, I think they're kind of
Mhm.
close, but so it's mainly, I guess, kind of around the cap rate discussion at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Stevenson.
I was leaning towards the same thing. I was gonna ask you, can you just give me another Cole's notes of your cap rate argument one more time?
Yeah, no, so at 5.35, again, we feel based on these type of buildings at a market cap rate, and the evidence that we've provided for market caps, at 5.35, we feel that it's already on the higher end to begin with. So I don't see a reason here again that we need to adjust the cap rate further. And so really based on a building of this style and the cap rate evidence, like we have, I mean, 150 Hendon, market cap, we 4%. I mean, I know there was rebuttal about that. We still feel reasonable in our cap rate application. So 5.3%, I think, is more than accommodating enough for this style of building, and the situation at hand.
Thank you. No further questions.
All right, thank you. So, Mr. Mikulek, this is all model driven, correct?
That's
Okay.
cool.
So you're saying the model has taken into consideration, A, that this is social housing, B, that a third of the units are bachelor, and that this property is almost 50 years old?
That's correct.
All right, thank you. Ms. Cates, if you'd like to give us your brief.
Thank you. So if you turn to page 2, we have our requested assessment of $6,713,000. On page 6, we have our property maps. And then some exterior photos on page 7. Property description on page 8. So the subject is on the east side of Pembina between Killarney and Dalhousie in the Fort Richmond area. It is a 6-story building built in the mid-70s. There are 95 units, which includes a high proportion of smaller suites, given that it's seniors housing. We note that the suites are approximately 378 square feet for a bachelor, 525 square feet for a 1-bedroom, and 656 square feet for a 2-bedroom. There is limited parking based on the number of units, and the property is adjacent to a retention pond. If you go to page 13, we have the overview of our income approach. So again, this property is social housing. We are applying market rents of $899,278 or $789 per unit per month. Market vacancy of 3.1%. And based on our 3-year stabilization of expenses, along with 4-year stabilization of repair and maintenance, we are applying expenses of $468,624 or 53.8% of effective gross income. We again have our cap rates for social housing on page 14, and I'll just move through to page 18, which is our cap rate discussion for this property. We are applying a cap rate of 6%. Our base cap rate would start at 5.5%, and we're considering adjustments for low-income tenancy, social housing, as well as the fact that it is seniors housing. Suites are small. There is limited parking. That would be less desirable from a market perspective because there's only so much room to increase rents when you have smaller units. And for the most part, having parking would be considered desirable to tenants. So if you go to page 20, we have our income and expense breakdown. So we have an EGI of $871,400. We have expenses of $468,624, which gives an expense ratio of 53.8%. I would again echo the assessor's points that the financials had changed styles. So I did my best to get the consistent figures in here, but there were some figures where they just changed the style over time. Another comment in terms of the taxes. So this property is 40S, meaning they're school tax exempt. That's based on its operation as seniors housing. But how we treat the taxes is we calculate the taxes as if it were a standard multi-residential property at class code 20. The reason being that if this property transacted and it was no longer used as seniors housing, they would not get the beneficial tax treatment of 40S. So in looking at it at a market perspective from NOI, that is why we have the note there about calculating the class code 20 taxes. Net operating income would be $402,776 with a 6% cap rate, gives an indicated value of $6,713,000 rounded. Repair and maintenance on page 21. And then we have an appendix starting on page 23. We just include a snip from A&O as well as the financials that we reviewed. And that would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cates. Questions, Mr. Michalak?
No questions, thank you.
I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
I have no questions,
Oh.
thank you.
Thank you.
That's weird, I don't know what's going on.
You were almost completely muted when you first spoke.
Thank you.
Ms. Knight, any questions?
Yeah, just in regards to that social housing parking, does most social housings have full 95, like full rate of parking, or do they have lesser parking?
So it depends on the type of social housing. Typically, if it's like if it's not seniors housing, if we're looking at family style or just standard apartments, we do tend to see that they would offer parking, especially at like family type units. Usually they do have sufficient parking, but what we tend to see for seniors is that they offer less parking based on presumably their operation as seniors housing. Maybe there's less need for vehicles, but the idea would be that if we're looking at it, if this transacted for the market, then would that be less desirable? And I believe it would be. So I guess to summarize, seniors housing would typically have less parking.
Okay. And I have one question about the last property, so I'll let the chairperson know when I can ask that.
About the previous property, Ms. Knight?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You only had 2 years worth of statements, why not 3?
To be honest, that's just what we had available. We didn't have the 2021 information for that prior property. We had it for this property, so we used it here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know why, that was all. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Stephenson, any questions?
I have no questions, thank you.
And I also have no questions. And does either party have a wish for, I'm going to say, an overall summation? I think one of you had mentioned that at the beginning of the hearing.
Yeah, I just want to touch on just the summation overall about the cap rates in that the city of Winnipeg, the way we calculate the cap rates is kind of the same way that we look at the subject property in terms of historical stabilized income, and then with the subject property being based on that type of information. So we feel that information and the values we give with the cap rates is perfectly applicable for the nature of the discussion around the subject property. So that would be my summation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Cates?
I would say that we're very transparent in all the information we use in terms of all the income and expenses, as well as our cap rate study with all of our calculations. The city just provides final figures. They don't provide all of that information. So I just would ask that that be taken into account, that we are providing everything that we're using. Thank you.
I thank you. All the, excuse me, all the items have been heard on the docket this morning, and this hearing is adjourned. And I would like to thank Mr. Michalak and Ms. Cates for their presentations this morning. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Madam Chair, I'll go take us offline.
Thank you.
Excuse me. please.